Before this year, the words Genesis Mini would have sparked fear instead of excitement. Sega has allowed others to make their take on a plug-and-play mini console using the Genesis' stable of software in the past, but this year they've decided to try their hand at making one of their own.
That's cool.
It's hard to believe in the post-Dreamcast era, but Sega was once Nintendo's chief rival in the hardware business. Speaking of hardware, let's begin by talking about the design of the Genesis Mini. Until now, the SNES and NES Classic consoles were the best of the recent spate of mini consoles hitting the market from a design perspective, but Sega firmly tops both of them in this regard. Sega brought back the design team that worked on the original Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive as it's known in Japan and Europe, to design the Mini too. The result is one of the most faithful reproductions of a console I've ever seen. Much like Nintendo's classic offerings, the Genesis Mini fits in the palm of your hand. It's about a quarter the size of the original console, and despite being a love letter to the weirdness of 90s console design, it's just adorable. Every small detail of the original is replicated here. The cartridge flap that actually functions, and Sega actually even made some tiny cartridge inserts that, while non-functional, fit inside. They're so cute! The volume slider on the front of the console that actually slides up and down, and even the port on the side where one would attach a Sega CD. All of these little features are strictly cosmetic, meaning they don't add any real functionality to the console, but they show an attention to detail and a level of pride in the product that's impossible to deny. The two included 3-button controllers have a similar heft and feel to the original Genesis pads, though they've ditched their old controller interface in favor of USB. The cords are a bit on the shortish side, measuring in at about 5 or 6 feet each. I don't know their exact length because I didn't feel like breaking out a ruler, but they couldn't quite reach my couch. Thankfully, this is easily resolved with a USB extension cable, which you can pick up just about anywhere for just a few dollars. The D-pads on these controllers have a texture to them that feels a bit rougher than I remember, but once I was playing, that thought quickly faded from my mind. Overall, the Genesis Mini and its controllers look and feel like the same hardware I played so many games on in the 90s. Speaking of games, there's a lot to unpack here. 42 games, to be exact. That's double the amount available on the SNES Classic, even when accounting for Star Fox 2's inclusion. The Genesis Mini even doubles the number of unreleased games through the inclusion of Darius and Tetris. Darius is a completely new port, built from the ground up for the Genesis Mini, and Sega commissioned Tetris to be completed and released for the console. Prior to the release of the Genesis Mini, only 10 copies of the Mega Drive version of Tetris were thought to exist. On the decidedly less rare but still interesting side of things, Mega Man The Wily Wars is also included, though it doesn't really qualify as an unreleased game, because it was released in both Europe and Japan, and was available through the Sega Channel, Sega's old cable TV games download service here in the US. For US-based Mega Man fans, that's sure to be exciting news, but I felt like they were just inferior ports of classic NES games crammed onto the system to get a very particular subset of diehards interested in the console. Before this, you would have to purchase a reproduction cart or import the game to get these, and while it isn't exactly a high-dollar item, rare games like these are cool to see, and there's no doubt some will appreciate this inclusion more than I do. In terms of sheer variety, the Genesis Mini wins again. Game selection, on the other hand, may prove to be divisive for some. Where Nintendo's mini consoles are packed full of games that are inarguably genre-defining, the Genesis includes some massive hits but sits them alongside some games that only the most hardcore Sega fans will love. With 42 games on this thing, however, it's hard to find fault for some picks being lesser known than others. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 shares space with the awful Genesis version of Virtua Fighter 2, for instance. Alex Kidd's worst ever game is on here too, and Light Crusader is a game I had never heard of before trying it for the first time on the Mini. Another more optimistic way to frame this, however, is that the Genesis Mini has something for everyone. No matter what kind of Genesis fan you are, there's bound to be at least one game you like on here, if not a handful. There are, however, some glaring omissions on this list. Sonic 3 is notably absent, as well as Sonic & Knuckles. Shinobi, one of Sega's biggest franchises of the time, is only represented by Shinobi 3, which, while excellent in my opinion, pales in comparison to Revenge of Shinobi. Overall, I found that I enjoyed more games than I disliked on the roster, and for the asking price, you're getting some fairly hard-to-find titles. Gunstar Heroes, for instance, goes for nearly $200 online these days. Its inclusion in the Genesis Mini makes it worth the price of admission alone if you're looking for an official way to play this game on Sega hardware. When I received my review unit a month or so ago, I invited a friend over and we spent all night playing through games on this thing. We had an absolute blast. We played through Altered Beast, Comix Zone, Sonic 1 and 2, Streets of Rage, and a bunch more in a single sitting. Without the burden of critical analysis and playing this device as it's meant to be played, strictly for enjoyment, everything felt exactly the way I remembered it. When I was playing these games, I felt like I was transported back to my parents' living room. Sitting next to a friend, playing on the ground, looking up at the TV because the cords were too short felt like a perfect distillation of my childhood. Sure, there are differences. I don't have to change cartridges, the controllers feel a little bit different, the buttons click louder than I remember, and I'm also an old man now whose bones hurt. But playing like this was just magical. When it was time to shake off the familiar, my feelings were a little more mixed. I'm going to come right out and say it. Tetris on the Genesis is utterly terrible. It's Tetris, but with the world's worst static background and music that just doesn't do anything for me. I've played shareware versions of Tetris on Windows 3.1 that felt more engaging than this, and in a world where Tetris 99 exists, I just don't see the need for this version. Nobody is nostalgic for a game that they never saw or owned, and it doesn't have the legacy of, say, Star Fox 2 to get people curious. We've all played Tetris, and we've all played a better version of it than this. Darius is a perfect example of the type of unreleased gem that I like finding on consoles like this. If I didn't have 41 other games to check out, I could have spent a month playing this one alone easily. But that Sega hardware comes with a caveat, of course. Inside this box, like every other mini console on the market, there's software emulation going on. That means that you'll never truly reach one-to-one performance as you might with a more expensive modern solution such as Analog's Mega SG, to say nothing of playing the games on the original hardware. Software emulation carries inherent latency to it because the software is interpreting how a Genesis would react. This begs the question, if it's software-based emulation, how good is it? Fortunately, the answer is that the emulation is very good. Sega commissioned M2, a company that's best known for the excellent Sega Ages games that have steadily been releasing on most modern platforms for over the last couple of years, to write the emulator used in the Genesis Mini, and the results are nothing short of extraordinary. By default, you have a pixel-perfect 4:3 aspect ratio selected, but you can choose to stretch this to 16:9 or use a CRT filter. I never put old 4:3 games in widescreen because it just looks wrong to me. But I'm a bit softer on CRT filters since they remind me of the old days, though I'm not a fan of the Genesis Mini's CRT filter. All my games looked a bit too muddy for my taste, and it wasn't something I enjoyed looking at. Aside from the default Genesis grid pattern border, there's a Sonic-themed border and just black. I kept the grid lines on, but I much prefer the options Nintendo has on the SNES Classic. If you're really observant, you might notice minor audio lag in every game, but for me it was something I didn't notice until someone pointed it out. Every game I tested ran almost exactly as I remembered them, for better or worse. For example, as a kid I remembered Strider as one of the most impressive games on the Genesis from a technical perspective. When I played it on the Mini, I couldn't believe how many sprites were popping into view and how poor the game performed overall. I had to go pick up a copy of the game and play it again to check it out, and yep, it's as bad on the original hardware as it is on the Mini. If you try to stack the Genesis Mini up against the original hardware, you'll start to notice other differences. Describing the audio on the Mini is a difficult task, because Sega themselves made under-the-hood changes to the Genesis sound chip throughout its lifetime, meaning that depending on what Genesis you grew up with, your games may sound different to you. I grew up with a Model 1 Genesis, which is what the Mini's outer design is modeled after. When playing the Mini by itself, everything sounded as I remembered, but when I went back and played on a Genesis, I noticed that all the sounds were ever so slightly different. But not to the point where they felt different, and I think that's really important. When you're playing this, you probably won't feel like things sound wrong, unless you're making a direct comparison. If I had to list one minor gripe about the console, it's that navigating menus is a chore. To switch between games on the Mini, you have to walk up to the console and hit the reset button, or hold the start button down on Player 1's controller for about 5 seconds. At least this is better than the SNES and NES Classic, both of which required you to use a Wii controller if you wanted to bring up the menu without walking over. Holding start will bring up a menu that allows you to save or load a save state, quit to the main menu to select another game, or reset the game you're currently playing. 5 seconds doesn't sound like a long time to wait, but no matter how many times I did it, I always felt unsure if I had held it long enough and it wasn't working, or if I just needed to be more patient. It's worth noting, however, that if you plug in a 6-button Genesis pad or a USB Saturn pad, which I happen to have laying around, tapping a shoulder button will bring up the menu immediately, eliminating this issue entirely. The menu and the UI design are fairly Spartan, but they get the job done. Everything is clearly labeled and easy to find. Buttons are responsive and there isn't any lag or delay getting to what you want. The main menu screen shows the box art for the various games included in the console, and you can sort alphabetically or by release date, which is nice, and you can even display just the spines in case you want the menu to look like a shelf full of Genesis games. I prefer the SNES Classic menu as it feels a bit more fun to go through, but the Genesis Mini does have the SNES Classic topped in one key area. When you change your language on the console, you get that region's box art as well, which is a really cool addition. And if you change to Japanese, Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine will swap out for proper Puyo Puyo, which is a great addition. Each region also has a distinctive menu style with that region's appropriate name and logo for the console itself, which is a really cool touch I wish Nintendo would have copied. The Genesis Mini is an example of how to do a device of this type the right way. It shows respect for the Genesis's legacy, includes a slew of titles with something for everyone, has excellent hardware design with an incredible level of attention to detail, and emulation that is as faithful as possible to the original hardware. Sega and M2 have done an incredible job bringing this vision to life in a way that fills old fans with me like delight and is sure to introduce a new generation of fans to some truly amazing games they may have missed. While I would have loved to have seen Sonic 3 and Revenge of Shinobi on the console, it's hard to fault it when it includes 2 times the amount of games on the SNES Classic for the same price. I love the Genesis Mini, and if you pick one up, I'm sure you will too. That about wraps it up for our review of the Sega Genesis Mini. As always, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more reviews just like this one and all other things gaming as well. Make sure to ring that notification bell to be notified every time we upload a new video, and we'll catch you next time. Bye!